The Wolf of Seoul was walking through his district when something greasy tugged on the sleeve of his $5,000 Italian suit. Not a knife, not a wire, and not a gun, but a half-eaten sandwich. He looked down. A 5-year-old girl stood in front of him, face streaked with tears, dirt on her dress, holding that piece of bread with 2 shaking hands like it was a diamond. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It's all I have left." His 10 bodyguards moved instantly. Too close, too aggressive. But Min-Jae raised a single hand, freezing them in place. Men usually paid him millions in black duffel bags. People paid him in fear. No one had ever tried to pay him with their own survival. He crouched low, bringing his tattooed neck eye level with her. "What do you want, little one?" She swallowed hard, pushing the sandwich toward him. "I want you to make the bad men leave," she cried. "Grandma called the police, but the police are scared of them." That made the wolf pause. She leaned in, trembling. "Grandma says everyone is scared of them, except you." That's when he noticed her ribs pressing against her worn dress and a red mark on her cheek. The mafia boss slowly took the half-eaten sandwich, not because he was hungry, but because this payment was worth more than his entire empire. "Stay with me until the end, because how Min-Jae repaid this debt didn't just save a bakery, it burned the city's underworld to the ground." To understand why the trembling girl was such an anomaly, you have to understand the silence that usually followed Min-Jae. He didn't need to shout to be heard. In the neon-soaked arteries of Seoul's nightlife district, silence was his loudest weapon. Before the girl, before the sandwich, there was only the hierarchy, and Min-Jae sat at its absolute apex. They called him the Wolf of Seoul not because he was wild, but because he killed with a precision that left no scraps behind. When his convoy of matte black sedans idled at the curb, the effect was instantaneous. The chaotic rhythm of the street, the K-pop blasting from storefronts, the drunken laughter of salarymen, the sizzle of street food vendors, didn't just fade, it evaporated. A heavy, suffocating quiet descended, the kind usually reserved for funerals or executions. He stepped onto the pavement, his Italian leather shoes making a sharp click that seemed to echo louder than the city traffic. He walked with the casual indifference of a man who owned the very concrete beneath his feet. To his left and right, the transformation was absolute. The owner of a bustling pojamika, a man who usually shouted orders at his cooks with a cigarette dangling from his lip, instantly killed the burner on his grill. He bowed so low his forehead nearly brushed the grease-stained table, terrified that the smoke from his cooking might drift in the boss's direction. Further down, a group of unruly university students, loud on soju, sobered up in a heartbeat. One of Min-Jae's lieutenants didn't even have to look at them, a simple adjustment of his cufflink sent them scattering into the shadows of an alleyway, eyes wide, mouths shut. Even the police patrol car parked on the corner suddenly found a reason to be elsewhere, its lights flickering off. As it reversed slowly out of sight, Min-Jae noticed none of it. Or rather, he noticed it all, but acknowledged nothing. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, his mind calculating ledgers, territories, and debts. In his world, eye contact was a currency, and nobody on this street was rich enough to afford it. He was a ghost made of iron and expensive fabric, drifting through a world that bent to his will. He was untouchable, a god of the underworld wrapped in a bespoke suit, convinced that nothing in this city could ever catch him off guard. That was, until a tiny, dirty hand reached out and shattered the silence. Min-Jae's chief of security, a man named Daewon who was built like a vending machine, stepped forward, his hand already reaching inside his jacket. To him, an unauthorized approach was a threat, whether it held a gun or a piece of bread. "Boss, step back," Dawon grunted, his shadow falling over the child. "Stand down," Min-Jae said softly. The command was barely a whisper, but Dawon froze. Instantly, stepping back into the formation with the disciplined obedience of a trained dog. Min-Jae crouched. It was a movement that cost him thousands in tailoring, the fabric of his bespoke suit straining as he brought his eyes level with the girl's tear-stained face. Up close, the reality of her desperation was sharp, the smell of sweat, old dust, and the stale aroma of the sandwich she was pushing toward his chest. "You know who I am?" Min-Jae asked, his voice devoid of the warmth usually reserved for children. The girl nodded, her messy ponytail bobbing. "Grandma says you're the wolf. She says everyone is scared of you." A flicker of something indistinguishable crossed Min-Jae's eyes. "And why are you giving your lunch to a monster?" "Because the police ran away," she whispered, the words tumbling out with a desperate tremor. That silenced the street corner. Grandma called them when the men came with the bats. The police saw the snake tattoo on their necks and they just got back in their car. They said it wasn't their jurisdiction. Min-Jae's expression didn't change, but the air around him grew heavy, charged with a sudden, violent static. Snake tattoos. The Viper Gang. They were bottom feeders, low-level loan sharks, who dealt in high-interest misery and operated on the fringes of the city. They were scavengers who were supposed to know better than to hunt in his territory. "The men," Haran continued, her voice hitching as fresh tears cut through the grime on her cheeks. "They broke the ovens. They hit Grandma until she couldn't stand up. They said if we didn't have the money by tonight, they would take me instead." She shoved the half-eaten sandwich into Min-Jae's hand, her small knuckles white from gripping. "It's so hard. I don't have money. I only have this. Please. Eat it so you'll be strong enough to make them leave." For the first time in a decade, Lee Min-Jae felt something other than cold calculation. It was a dull, burning heat in the center of his chest. A rival gang was operating on his streets, beating elderly women, and threatening to traffic children, all while the police turned a blind eye. They had broken the ecosystem. They had insulted his control. He looked from the pathetic offering of food in his palm to the terror in her wide, dark eyes. She wasn't asking for charity, she was hiring him. And she had just paid with everything she had left. The logical part of Lee Min-Jae's brain, the part that had kept him alive and on top for 15 years, screamed at him to walk away. Don't get involved. The code was simple: maintain order, collect debts, and never let the chaos of the civilian world bleed into the business. Children were not business. They were liabilities. They were messy, unpredictable, and vulnerable, everything he had trained himself not to be. He looked down at the sandwich. It was absurd. He had a meeting with the Busan Syndicate in 20 minutes that would decide the fate of the southern shipping routes. He should hand the bread back, signal Dawon to give the kid a stack of bills to assuage his conscience, and get back into the safety of his armored sedan. "I don't take food from children," Min-Jae said, his voice stiff, trying to rebuild the wall between them. He started to push her small hand away gently. "Go home to your grandmother." Haran didn't move. She didn't retreat. She just stood there, her arm extended, trembling not from fear anymore, but from sheer physical exhaustion. That was when the streetlights caught the details he had missed. As he pushed her hand back, he saw the knuckles. They were swollen, bruised purple and yellow, the skin scraped raw. He looked at her, synchronized and fluid. Some carried duffel bags that clinked with the heavy, metallic sound of tactical gear, others adjusted earpieces, their eyes scanning the rooftops and alleyways. Min-Jae stood at the head of the formation, the wind tugging at his coat. He looked at the assembly, 37 lethal professionals waiting for a command. He held up the empty wrapper of the strawberry jam sandwich, crumpling it in his fist like a declaration of war. "Tonight isn't about territory," Min-Jae said, his voice carrying over the idling engines. "Tonight, there is a customer service dispute. An unauthorized group of amateurs hurt a client of mine. They threatened a child. They block, and in that manufactured void, the ghost unit began their work. There was no shouting, no chaotic gunfire, no Hollywood explosions. There was only the wet thwip of suppressed heavy-caliber rounds and the heavy thud of bodies hitting the concrete. The 6 Vipers playing cards by the loading dock never even stood up. 2 seconds. That was all it took for the perimeter guards to be neutralized, their cigarettes still burning in the ashtrays. As they slumped over the folding table, eliminated by a synchronized volley from the darkness, Min-Jae walked through the main bay doors, his stride unbroken, stepping over the threshold as his men flowed around him like smoke. They moved with a terrifying fluidity, a hive mind of violence. They checked corners, cleared rooms, and advanced. The Vipers inside were sloppy, laughing, drunk on cheap beer and hubris, completely unaware that death had already walked through the front door. A door to the break room was kicked open. Before the 3 men inside could reach for their weapons, they were dropped by double taps to the chest. The ghost unit moved over the fallen, boots silent on the oil-stained floor. It wasn't a battle, it was a fumigation. Min-Jae watched with cold detachment, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes scanning for the stairwell that led to the abyss below. "Clear," DeWan whispered into his comms. "Basement access secured." They descended into the belly of the warehouse. The air here was different, thicker, colder, smelling of rust and fear. The sub-basement was a cavernous space lined with massive red shipping containers. The silence here was heavy, punctuated only by the faint, muffled sounds of movement from inside the steel boxes. Min-Jae signaled to the lead breacher. The man stepped forward with a thermal cutter. Sparks flew in a controlled shower as the locking mechanism on the nearest container was sliced away. The metal groaned, a sound that echoed like a scream in the quiet dark. DeWan grabbed the heavy iron handle and hauled the door open. Light from the tactical rails of 10 rifles flooded the interior. Inside, huddled on dirty mattresses and huddled against the walls, were dozens of women and children. They flinched, shielding their eyes, expecting another beating, expecting the Vipers. Instead, they saw the wolf. Min-Jae stepped into the light, his silhouette framed by the armed men behind him. He didn't look like a hero, he looked like a reaper in a tailored suit. But when he spoke, his voice cut through the terror. "You're leaving," Min-Jae said, the promise hanging in the air like iron. "Now." Min-Jae left the weeping survivors in the care of his medics and ascended the rusted iron staircase to the overseer's office. The metal grate clanged beneath his boots, a slow, rhythmic death knell announcing his arrival. DeWan kicked the office door open, the wood splintering inward, revealing the nerve center of the Viper's operation. Inside, the 2 leaders of the Viper gang, Jang-soo and his younger brother, were frantically stuffing stacks of cash into a duffel bag. They froze as the Wolf of Seoul stepped over the threshold, flanked by 2 enforcers with leveled silencers. Jiangsu dropped the money, his hands raising slowly in a gesture of surrender that lacked any real humility. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but his eyes still held the arrogant gleam of a man who believed everything was a transaction. Min-Jae, Jiangsu stammered, forcing a greasy smile. Wait. Hold on. We didn't know you were expanding this far south. We can work this out. Min-Jae didn't speak. He walked to the desk, picked up a ledger, and flipped it open. Pages of names, dates, and prices attached to human beings. It's just business, right? The younger brother interjected, his voice trembling. We respect your territory, Wolf. We'll cut you in 40%. No, 50. Look at the numbers. This operation prints money. You walk away now, and you take half of everything. Min-Jae closed the ledger with a sharp snap that sounded like a gunshot in the small room. He looked at the brothers with a gaze so empty it made the younger one step back against the wall. You think this is about territory? Min-Jae asked softly. It's always about territory, Jiangsu insisted, desperate now. We're businessmen. Just like you. No, Min-Jae corrected him. I sell protection. You sell misery. He took a step closer, invading their space. You beat an old woman. You starved a 5-year-old girl for 3 days. And you tried to barter with her life. She's just a kid. Jiangsu yelled. Who cares? We're talking about millions of one here. That kid, Min-Jae said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper, paid me a retainer fee this evening. A half-eaten sandwich. It was everything she had. He pulled a silenced pistol from inside his jacket. The movement was so smooth it looked like a magic trick. You can't do this, Jiangsu screamed, backing up until he hit the desk. This is bad business. It's irrational. You're right, Min-Jae said, raising the weapon. Ideally, I would tax you. I would absorb your operation. I would make a profit. He leveled the barrel at Jiangsu's forehead. But the client asked me to make the bad man leave. And unlike you, I always honor my contracts. Min-Jae, please. This isn't business, the wolf said. This is personal. 2 muffled shots coughed into the stale air. The brothers collapsed, their negotiation ending in permanent silence. Min-Jae holstered his weapon, turned his back on the bodies, and walked out without checking for a pulse. He didn't need to. The wolf never missed. Min-Jae stepped out of the warehouse, the heavy steel door clanging shut behind him, sealing the carnage away from the night air. He didn't look back. He adjusted his suit jacket, checking for blood, but there was none. The wolf was always clean. He walked to the black Maybach where Daewon stood guard. The window rolled down, and Harin's small, pale face appeared. She didn't ask what happened. She just looked at him with those wide, knowing eyes, searching for a sign that the nightmare was over. It's done, Min-Jae said, his voice surprisingly soft. The bad men are gone. They won't ever come back. He signaled the driver. Take us to the hospital. My men found your grandmother. She's safe. The ride was silent, but the tension had bled out of the air. When they arrived at the private wing of the Asen Medical Center, where Min-Jae's organization handled their own off-the-books injuries, Harin didn't wait for the door to be fully opened. She scrambled out, her small shoes slapping against the polished linoleum of the hallway. Helmiani. An elderly woman, battered and bandaged but very much alive, sat up in the bed. Her eyes widened in disbelief as the small girl launched herself into her arms. The grandmother wept, burying her face in Haren's messy hair, murmuring prayers of gratitude. It was a raw, unfiltered moment of love that made Min-Jae's bodyguards look away, uncomfortable with the sudden intrusion of humanity into their violent lives. Min-Jae stood in the doorway, watching. He held a piece of paper in his hand, the promissory note he had taken from the Viper's safe. It was the debt that had nearly cost this family their lives. He walked to the bedside. The grandmother looked up, terror flashing in her eyes as she recognized the wolf of Seoul standing in her recovery room. She pulled Haren tighter, trying to shield her. "Don't be afraid," Min-Jae said. He held up the debt paper. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he tore it in half. Then into quarters. He let the pieces flutter into the wastebasket. Like snow. "Your debt is paid. The Vipers have dissolved their partnership." Haren pulled away from her grandmother and looked up at him. "Did the sandwich help?" she asked seriously. "Did it make you strong?" Min-Jae looked down at the child. A ghost of a smile, the first one his men had seen in years, touched the corner of his mouth. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp, heavy envelope. He placed it on the bedside table. It wasn't a bill, it was a deed to their bakery. Fully paid off, plus enough operating capital to last a decade. "The sandwich was excellent," Min-Jae replied, bowing slightly to the 5-year-old as if she were a queen. "But you overpaid. This is your change." He turned to leave, his shadow retreating from the room. The job was completed at no charge. He called back over his shoulder. "Consider it a professional courtesy. Time moves fast in Seoul. Skid Row tenements become glass skyscrapers overnight, and memories of the past are usually paved over with fresh concrete. But in one quiet corner of the district, the Yoon bakery didn't just survive, it thrived. The smell of fresh cream bread and roasted coffee wafted out onto the street, drawing lines of customers every morning. Behind the counter stood Haren, no longer a starving child in a torn dress, but a bright, healthy teenager with a smile that lit up the room. She moved with confidence, safe in a city that had once tried to swallow her whole. High above the bakery, in the penthouse office of the Torino Tower, Lee Min-Jae stood watching the city lights. His hair was touched with silver at the temples now, and the lines around his eyes were deeper, etched by years of holding the underworld at bay. He was still the wolf, still the man whispered about in fear by rivals and politicians alike. But the silence that surrounded him was no longer empty. His office was a museum of power, minimalist furniture, expensive art, and a view that cost millions. Yet, visitors' eyes were always drawn to the one thing that didn't fit. Hanging directly behind his massive mahogany desk, right where a diploma or a photo with the president should have been, was a simple, framed piece of construction paper. It was a drawing, done in the waxy, uneven strokes of a 5-year-old's crayon. On the left was a small stick-figure girl in a pink dress. On the right was a tall, looming figure in a black suit. Between them, drawn in bright orange, was a sandwich. Underneath, in careful, crooked Hangul, were the words, "Thank you for eating with me." Min-Jae turned from the window and looked at the drawing. He had brokered peace treaties between warring syndicates, controlled shipping lanes, and amassed a fortune that could buy small countries. But he had never framed any of those achievements. He reached out, his fingers hovering near the glass. That drawing was the only receipt he had. kept from the most important transaction of his life. It was a daily reminder that power wasn't measured by how many men feared you, but by who felt safe enough to stand beside you. The Wolf of Seoul straightened his tie, his reflection catching in the glass of the frame. He had saved the girl, yes. But looking at the drawing, Min-Jae knew the truth. When she had handed him that half-eaten sandwich all those years ago, she was the one who had saved him.